you search for podcasts today, you will find millions of them. There are podcasts about business, culture, history, comedy, technology, education, sport, almost every topic imaginable. But despite this huge number of podcasts, something interesting happens when you start listening to them. Some podcasts immediately capture your attention. They feel clear, they feel engaging, they sound professional, and you want to keep listening. Other podcasts struggle. They feel unfocused. The conversation drifts. The sound quality isn't quite right. Or the purpose of the show never becomes fully clear. The difference between these two experiences is rarely luck. Great podcasts are almost always designed carefully. They are built around clear ideas, thoughtful structure, and high-quality production. In this episode, we're going to explore what actually makes a podcast work. This is Podcasting That Works, a short series exploring how podcasts can build influence, trust, and meaningful audience connection. I'm Craig Burgess, founder of One Stop Podcasts. In the previous episode, we explored how organisations are using podcasts across business, education, and creative industries. In this episode, we're going to explore what actually makes a podcast great. Because successful podcasts rarely happen by accident. They're usually the result of thoughtful design. A clear podcast concept. The first thing every great podcast has is a clear concept. This might sound obvious, but it's actually where many podcasts struggle. A podcast concept answers some very simple but very important questions. What is the podcast about? Who is it for? Why does it exist? When those questions are clear, the podcast becomes much easier to develop. For example, a podcast might focus on helping entrepreneurs understand how to build successful businesses. Another podcast might explore the creative process behind music production. Another might focus on conversations about education and learning. The key point is that the podcast has a clear identity. Listeners understand what the show is about and what they can expect from each episode. Without that clarity, a podcast can quickly become unfocused. Conversations drift across topics. Episodes feel inconsistent, and audiences struggle to understand why they should keep listening. A strong concept creates direction. It gives the podcast a purpose, and that purpose helps attract the right audience. Understanding the audience. Closely connected to the podcast concept is the idea of audience. Great podcasts are designed with a specific audience in mind. Instead of trying to appeal to everyone, they focus on a particular group of listeners. That group might be professionals within a certain industry. It might be students learning a particular subject. It might be people interested in a niche topic or community. When a podcast understands its audience clearly, everything becomes easier. The topics become clearer. The tone becomes clearer. The type of guests becomes clearer. The structure of the conversation becomes clearer. In contrast, podcasts that try to speak to everyone often struggle to connect with anyone in particular. This is something we often explore when developing new podcast concepts. Defining the audience early helps shape every aspect of the show. Format and structure. Another important element of successful podcasts is structure. Even the most natural-sounding podcasts are usually carefully structured behind the scenes. For example, a podcast might follow a simple format such as an introduction, a main conversation, a short reflection or takeaway, and a closing section. Other podcasts might use interviews. Some use storytelling. Some include multiple segments or recurring features. The format doesn't need to be complicated, but having a consistent structure helps listeners understand the rhythm of the show. It also helps the host guide the conversation effectively. Without structure, podcasts can sometimes feel like unplanned conversations that wander without direction. Structure provides clarity and focus while still allowing the conversation to feel natural. Production quality. Another important element that shapes how a podcast feels is production quality. This includes several things. First, there is audio clarity. Listeners are surprisingly sensitive to sound quality. If the audio is difficult to hear, distorted, or inconsistent, it can quickly become tiring to listen to. Second, there is editing. Great podcasts are usually edited carefully to remove distractions, tighten the conversation, and improve pacing. Editing helps the conversation feel smooth and engaging. Third, there is sonic identity. Many successful podcasts include recognizable music, transitions, or sound design elements that help create a sense of identity. These small details may seem subtle, but they contribute significantly to the overall listening experience. When these elements come together well, the podcast feels polished and professional. And importantly, it allows listeners to focus on the ideas rather than being distracted by technical issues. Consistency. Finally, one of the most important factors in podcast success is consistency. Audiences tend to develop listening habits. If a podcast publishes regularly, listeners begin to expect new shows. Over time, this creates a sense of continuity and familiarity. Consistency doesn't necessarily mean publishing every week. Some podcasts publish every 2 weeks or even once per month. What matters is that the schedule is clear and reliable. Consistency also applies to tone and content. Listeners should have a good sense of what the podcast represents. That familiarity builds trust, and trust is one of the most valuable things a podcast can develop. So when we think about what makes a great podcast, 5 key ideas stand out. First, successful podcasts begin with a clear concept. Second, they understand their audience. Third, they use structure and format to guide the conversation. Fourth, they pay attention to production quality. And finally, they maintain consistency over time. When these elements come together, a podcast becomes much more than just recorded audio. It becomes a platform for meaningful communication. In the final episode of this series, we'll explore how podcasts grow and develop over time, and what it takes to build a podcast that lasts. We'll look at how podcasts develop audiences, how they evolve creatively, and how organisations can think about podcasting as a long-term platform rather than a short-term project. If you're interested in launching a podcast or learning more about professional podcast production, you can visit onestoppodcast.com to learn more. Thanks for listening.